Chapter 23. Murder was the case. Richard Nixon and his team looked at the way George Wallace had run his campaign, vote for hate, and felt like it was a good idea to follow in his footsteps. Nixon believed the segregationist approach was a good one because it would lock down all the true blue segregationists, like the varsity squad of racists. Along with those, Nixon figured he could also attract the white people who were afraid of everything black. Black neighborhoods, black schools, black people. And the brilliant game plan Nixon used to drive an even bigger wedge and get racists on his side was to simply demean black people in every speech while also praising white people. But the magic trick in it all, the how did you hide that rabbit in that hat part, was that he did all this without ever actually saying black people and white people. It goes back to things like the word ghetto. And today maybe you've heard urban, or how about undesirables? Oh, and my favorite, not dangerous elements, which would eventually become thugs. My mother would call this getting over, but for the sake of this not history book, let's go with what the historians have named it, the Southern Strategy. And in fact, it was and remained over the next 5 decades the national strategy Republicans used to unite Northern and Southern racists, war hawks, and fiscal and social conservatives. The strategy was right on time, with the Southern strategy in full tilt, and with the messaging being all about law and order, which meant doing anything to shut down protests or at least to paint them as bloodbaths. Richard Nixon won the presidency. In the fall of 1969, with Charlene Mitchell's campaign behind her, Angela Davis settled into a teaching position at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. But the FBI had other plans. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, had launched a war to destroy the Black Power movement that year. And all they needed to cut Davis down was to know that she was part of the Communist Party. Ronald Reagan, the governor of California at the time, had her fired from UCLA. When she tried to plead her case, it set off a media storm. Hate mail started filling up her mailbox. She received threatening phone calls, and police officers started harassing her. And even though the California Superior Court would overturn her firing and allow her to go back to work, Reagan searched for new ways to get rid of her. And he would succeed. The next time, he fired her for speaking out in defense of 3 black inmates in Soledad State Prison, who she felt were detained only because they were Black Power activists. Here's what happened. George Jackson was transferred to Soledad from San Quentin after disciplinary infractions. He had already served some years after being accused of robbing a gas station of $70. His sentence for that crime, 1 year to life in prison. In 1970, a year after arriving in Soledad, Jackson and fellow black inmates John Clichette and Fleeta Drumgo were accused of murdering a prison guard in a racially charged prison fight. Whatever chance he had at freedom was now locked up with him behind bars. Angela Davis had become friends with George Jackson's younger brother Jonathan, who was committed to freeing his brother. They'd all been rallying. Angela Davis had been speaking. They had been fighting the good fight. But it wasn't enough for Jonathan Jackson, brother of George. He decided to take the freeing of his brother into his own hands. This is real. Pay attention. It's gonna go quickly. August 7th, 1970. Jonathan Jackson walked into a courtroom in California's Marin County. He was holding 3 guns. He took the judge, the prosecutor, and 3 jurors hostage. He freed 3 inmates who were on trial. He led the hostages to a van parked outside. Police opened fire. The shootout took the lives of the judge, 2 inmates, and also Jonathan Jackson. He was 17 years old. A week later, Angela Davis was charged with murder. Record scratch. Repeat. A week later, Angela Davis was charged with murder because police said one of the guns Jonathan Jackson used was actually hers. If found guilty, she'd be sentenced to death. Angela went on the run. She was caught months later on the other side of the country, New York, October 13th, 1970. She was arrested and brought to the New York Women's House of Detention. While she was in there, around so many other black and brown incarcerated women, she began to develop her black feminist theory. On the other side of the prison walls, organizations were fighting and rallying for her freedom. And this rallying cry continued after December 1970, when Davis was sent back to California, where she spent most of her jail time in solitary confinement awaiting trial. She read the letters, thousands of letters from activists and supporters. She also studied her case, studied it and studied it and studied it. And a year and a half later, her trial finally began. She represented herself and won. On June 4th, 1972, Angela Davis was free. But not free in her own mind until she could help all the women and men she was leaving behind bars get free. There was no value to her in her own exceptionalism. She was an anti-racist. She knew better than to beat her chest when there was a much bigger challenge to be beaten, much stronger chains to break. 3 years later, Angela Davis returned to teaching. Nixon had resigned from office after a scandal he wasn't punished for, no surprise, and Gerald Ford was president. Just telling you that because you'd probably be wondering what happened to Nixon. Turns out he was a liar and couldn't, as my mother would say, get over. Anyway, Davis had taken a job at the Claremont College's Black Studies Center in Southern California, and she realized quickly that not much had changed since he'd been gone. Segregationists were still arguing some kind of natural-born problem with black people, and assimilationists were still trying to figure out why integration had failed. And the one thing that black male assimilationist scholars kept arguing about was that black masculinity was what was frightening to white men. That it was sexual jealousy that spawned systemic oppression, which is ridiculous because it buys into the racist idea that black men are sexually superior, making them superhuman, making them not human, and also continues the narrative that black women just don't matter. Black women didn't have a place in the conversation, though they'd been the steadying stick from the moment the conversation began. All this is in line with decades, centuries of racist propaganda, centuries of white men and white women and black men all working to erase or discredit who they thought posed the greatest threat to freedom, even if it's only, in the case of black men, the freedom to pretend to be freer than they actually are. And what about the LGBT community? Were they not to be included in this conversation? Fortunately, there was media, but not another Tarzan or Planet of the Apes, not another Uncle Tom's Cabin either. This time, just like with novelist Zora Neale Hurston, who had in the past written Southern dialect into the mouths of strong women characters, their eyes were watching God, black women were screaming with black feminist anti-racist work. Audre Lorde produced essays, stories, and poems from the perspective of being black and lesbian. She pushed back against the idea that she, as a black person, woman, and lesbian, was expected to educate white people, men and or heterosexuals, in order for them to recognize her humanity. Ntozake Shange used her creative anti-racist energy to produce a play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough, portraying the lives of black women and their experiences of abuse, joy, heartbreak, strength, weakness, love, and longing for love. Some people were afraid it would strengthen stereotypes of black women. Some were afraid it would strengthen stereotypes of black men. Both fears are code for the fear of an anti-racist truth. Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple, a novel that presents a black woman dealing with abusive black men, abusive Southern poverty, and abusive racist whites. The tired argument about the black male stereotype arose again, but so what? And Michelle Wallace wrote a book called Black Macho and the Myth of the Superwoman. Wallace believed sexism was an even greater concern than racism. She was loved, but she was hated just as much. And while the idea of black masculinity was being challenged by black women, white masculinity was being threatened constantly by black men. So once again, white America created a symbol of hope, of man, of macho, of victor, and plastered it on the big screen. Again, this time, his name was Rocky. I'm sure you've seen at least one of the movies, even if it's one of the new ones. And if you haven't, you know the fight song. The song playing while Rocky runs up the set of museum steps, training, tired, but triumphant. Yeah. Rocky, played by Sylvester Stallone, was a poor, kind, slow-talking, slow-punching, humble, hard-working, steel-jawed Italian-American boxer in Philadelphia, facing off against the unkind, fast-talking, fast-punching, cocky African-American world heavyweight champion. I mean, really? Rocky's opponent, Apollo Creed, the new movies are about his son. With his amazing thunderstorm of punches, symbolized the empowerment movements, the rising black middle class, and the real-life heavyweight champion of the world in 1976, the pride of black power masculinity, Muhammad Ali. Rocky symbolized the pride of white supremacist masculinity's refusal to be knocked out from the thunderstorm of civil rights and black power protests and policies. Weeks before Americans ran out to see Rocky, though, they ran out to buy Alex Haley's Roots, the saga of an American family. Haley, who was known for working with Malcolm X on his autobiography, had now basically written the slave story of all slave stories. It was a 700-page book, then made into a miniseries that became the most watched show in television history. It blew up a bunch of racist ideas about how slaves were lazy brutes, mammies, and sambos, and how slave owners were benevolent and kind landlords. But as much as anti-racist black Americans loved their roots, racist white Americans loved, on and off screen, their Rocky, with his unrelenting fight for the law and order of racism. And then, in 1976, their Rocky ran for president. Chapter 24. What war on drugs? Not like Rocky, like not the character or the guy who played the character, Sylvester Stallone, though that would have been funny, or not. But it was in fact an actor, one who had already done damage to black people, the one who'd been gunning for Angela Davis, who kept her from working. That's right, Ronald Reagan was running for president. He'd lose the nomination to Gerald Ford in 1976, but would come right back in 1980 with a vengeance. He'd use an updated version of Law and Order politics and the Southern strategy to address his constituents and talk about his enemies without ever having to say white or black. He dominated the media. Angela Davis was running against him for the vice presidency and couldn't get any coverage, created false narratives about the state of the country, and won. And lots of things unfolded. New shaky propaganda that many people took seriously about genetics coding us to be who we are, as if there were a gene for racism. New anti-racist feminist thought coming from writers like Bell Hooks and, of course, Angela Davis, but nothing could prepare anyone for what was coming. 2 years into Reagan's presidency, he issued one of the most devastating executive orders of the 20th century, the war on drugs. Its role? Maximum punishment for drugs like marijuana. This war was really one on black people. At the time, drug crime was declining. As a matter of fact, only 2% of Americans viewed drugs as America's most pressing problem. Few believed that marijuana was even that dangerous, especially compared with the much more addictive heroin. But President Reagan wants to go to war. Against drugs? If you're like me, you're asking yourself, was he on drugs? Yes. Yes, he was. The most addictive drug known to America. Racism. It causes wealth, an inflated sense of self, and hallucinations. In this case, it would unfairly incarcerate millions of black Americans, and in 1986, during his second term, Reagan doubled down on the war on drugs by passing the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This bill gave a minimum 5-year sentence for a drug dealer or drug user caught with 5 grams of crack. The amount typically handled by blacks and poor people are the mostly white and rich users and dealers of powder cocaine who operated in neighborhoods with fewer police had to be caught with 500 grams to receive the same 5-year minimum sentence. Let that sink in. Same drug, different form. One gets 5 years in prison if caught with 5 grams, the size of 2 quarters. The other gets 5 years in prison for 500 grams, the size of a brick. The results should be obvious. Mass incarceration of black people, even though white people and black people were selling and using drugs at similar rates. Not to mention, police officers police black neighborhoods more, and the more police, the more arrests. It's not rocket science, it's racism. And it would, once again, tear the black community apart. More black men were going to prison, and when, if they came home, it was without the right to vote. No political voice. Also, no jobs, not just because of felony charges, but because Reagan's economic policies caused unemployment to skyrocket. So violent crimes rose because people were hungry, and according to Reagan and racists, it was all black people's fault, not the racist policies that jammed black people up. And the media, as always, drove the stereotypes without discussing the racist framework that created much of them. Once again, black people were lazy and violent, the men were absent from the home because they were irresponsible and careless, and the black family was withering due to all this, but especially, according to Reagan, because of welfare. There was no evidence to support any of this, but hey, who needs evidence when you have power, right? The worst part is that everyone believed it, even black people. And to offset that image, or at least attempt to, another television show was created portraying the perfect black family. The Cosby Show. A doctor and a lawyer with 5 children in the upscale section of Brooklyn Heights. Upper middle class, healthy marriage, good parents. The father, Heathcliff Huxtable, played by Bill Cosby, even has his office in his home so that he never has to risk not being there for his children. There's the older, responsible daughter, the rebellious second daughter, the goofy but endearing son, the awkward and nerdy third daughter, and the cute, lovable baby girl. And their collective role as a family of extraordinary Negroes was to convince white people that black families were more than what they were being portrayed to be. Which, of course, was racist in and of itself because it basically said that if a black family didn't operate like the Huxtables, they weren't worthy of respect. And of course, Cosby did nothing to slow Reagan's war. If anything, the show helped create a more polarizing view because in 1989, a Pulitzer Prize-winning, Harvard medical degree-holding Washington Post columnist named Charles Krauthammer invented the term crack baby. It was a term used to blanket a generation of black children born from drug-addicted parents, saying they were now destined for inferiority, that they were subhuman, that the drugs had changed their genetics. There was no science to prove any of this. But who needs science when you have racism? And that term, that label, crack baby, grew long arms and wrapped them around black children all over the inner cities of America, whether it was true or not. Krauthammer and racists had basically figured out how to create a generation of criminals in their minds. But black people, as always, fought back. And this time, in the late 80s, after the election of George H.W. Bush, who of course used Reagan's racist ideas to win, they would beat racism back with a beat.